Welcome to the Filmlings podcast,
a bi-weekly podcast where we analyze all that goes into effective filmmaking.
I'm Jonathan.
And I'm Alex.
And this is episode 106, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan and Meg Ryan and Meg Ryan.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah, so we're talking about three films starring Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan as voted on by our patrons.
I'm pretty sure
and
the
our
only three.
Redundancy, yeah, I think it is the only three. So they're all kind of fall in the rom-com romance genre. Two of them actually by the same director, and we're gonna get into all of that.
Yeah, we have a mini Nora Ephron episode today, famous for doing rom-coms. So real quick, details that are super important right now about our two co-stars this week. Tom Hanks, which by the way, real quick, Jonathan, this is one of the few episodes we've done based on an actor. I think we've done.
I feel like whenever we do series and polls are the only time that we actually do actor-based episodes,
we've done
except
less
for
than
Sidney
5.
Poitier. Yeah,
There hasn't been many.
right.
So Tom Hanks currently has coronavirus. If you're listening to this like years from now, that's you're going to have to Google it. But
completely irrelevant.
hopefully, you know what? Hopefully you're going to have to Google it. Hopefully it hasn't ended everything. Not because it's dangerous, but because it's ruining the world economy. Fun times. Anyway, the other co-star, Meg Ryan, currently does not have coronavirus, to the best of our knowledge.
Yeah, and so they did 3 films together, and those are our topics for today. And the first is actually quite different from the other two, quite different from a lot of movies. And that's Joe Versus the Volcano from 1990, directed by John Patrick Shanley. And the second film is Sleepless in Seattle from 1993, directed by Nora Ephron, which was nominated for Best Original Screenplay, Best Original Song, A Wink and a Smile by Harry Connick Jr. And the last film that we'll be talking about today is You've Got Mail from 1998, also directed by Nora Ephron. So we've kind of got and it's based on the film The Shop Around the Corner by Ernst Lubitsch. Yes, which is great, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today.
The Shop Around the Corner is my 4th favorite movie of all time, Jonathan.
I know, I saw that on your Letterboxd profile, and after watching it a couple months ago, I can definitely see where that's coming from. It is a delightful film.
It's relevant, too, because I feel like Jimmy Stewart and Tom Hanks are connected, not directly, but in a Tom Hanks kind of took over the role of Jimmy Stewart in Hollywood.
Yeah, his vibe.
Kind of like the same vibe.
At this point, if Tom Hanks did like a Jimmy Stewart biopic in the next 5 years, I would not be surprised.
Yeah, he's like the good guy in Hollywood. Always plays like these lovable roles. You can always think of like that one stuttery sound he makes in the same way. Kind of have the same face shape. Both played in a very similar rom-com role. Yeah, they have a lot of similarities.
I'm trying to think if Tom Hanks ever like has that one like creepy turn movie like Vertigo for Jimmy Stewart.
That's
I
a
can't
good
think of one
question.
off the top of my head.
That's a good question, Jonathan.
We'll get back to y'all on that. But all that is a digression. So let's have Jason set up Joe versus Volcano for us.
Joe versus the Volcano from 1990. Joe used to be a firefighter, but now he's a workaday chump, suffering under a terrible boss and a constant depression and series of physical maladies. Finally sick of being sick, Joe goes to the doctor only to discover that he has a brain cloud and only 6 months to live. Determined to live as much as possible in that time, Joe seizes the offer of one last all-expenses-paid vacation in exchange for jumping into a volcano at the end of it.
All right, Alex, this movie is one of those movies that I grew up with, and my parents have loved this movie forever, and it's one that I don't hear talked about hardly ever, and so it's one of those things that I can't really go into this with a completely neutral outlook, but you can because you've never seen it before. So tell me what your first impressions of Joe versus the Volcano were.
I really liked the movie. I was a little disturbed during the first part because Tom Hanks's hair was so horrendous. Of course,
Yeah,
that's on
that
purpose.
like greasy mullet. Yeah,
It's
which
so
is
bad.
intentional.
It's so bad. It's intentional, and they change it partway through the movie as he evolves as a character. But I really loved it. And then the thing I kept flashing back to was that it came out in 1990, which just seems so weird because it is very much a style before its time. Like
It's so stylized.
it's completely stylized. It's got these expressionist tones to the way the sets are constructed. Like the opening scene where they all walk into the factory. They're playing like this really, working man song. Is
The factory looks like a
basically-
face.
It's almost completely ripped from the walking into the factory scene from Metropolis, which is a German expressionist movie.
Or even modern times.
Yeah, it's very intentional, very expressionist. A lot of the sets throughout the whole movie kind of feel the same way. And then the comedy is like this comedy of over the top, the absurds. People acting, not just the acting wasn't very naturalistic. It was very over the top in this absurdist manner because that's what they're going for. That was not in vogue from the early 70s through,
Which we talked about the American New Wave, which was getting to this almost documentary style.
from the
dark
early from the
storytelling.
early 70s to like the late 90s. That was not in vogue. It wasn't until indie cinema people, basically like Wes Anderson, and Wes Anderson's kind of the one you can most refer to as like having a super stylized look and making it work, and bringing it back in vogue. And now you have Taika Waititi, and you have other people coming onto the scene. Like I was just telling you, Jonathan. I'm just blanking. She's a relatively new director. She hasn't done a lot of work, but she did Emma, which just came out like a few weeks ago. And it has that very stylized, absurdist feel to it, where it's a little different than reality, and it feels a little fake, but that's the point, is that it feels fake, it feels exaggerated, it feels over the top. And that's where you get the fun and the enjoyment out of it. It's like flipping through a pop-up book almost, with all these extreme, colorful sets that feel vibrant and real. And you're communicating outside of that naturalistic tonality, which gives you more range to play with, but it also requires an audience that's a little more accepting of that or understands that. I feel like our current audience, as is right now, in the land of cinema lovers, cinemaphiles, is completely primed and ready for that kind of thing. In 1990, probably not.
Yeah, you can even see in Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail, it's very much more like cut and dry kind of storytelling. It's just the characters and interaction and that kind of thing, and it's less about like, these grand scenes and like putting in a lot of these little kind of jokey moments. And there's a lot of like repetition and motifs in the visuals, and that's kind of how the film is built, even down to the fact of Meg Ryan playing 3 different characters, which we've got to kind of address, because it's like this fun. I could almost see this being done in theater, like as a stage production, because everything again is so over the top in that way. And Meg Ryan has to play 3 different characters that are all extremely different personalities on purpose in order to distinguish them. And it's got so much like fun in it and ridiculousness, and yet also a lot of heart and a lot of real stuff that it's getting to about soulless jobs and trying to, live away from fear. And I think, the fact that it's about a hypochondriac seems pretty relevant right now too, as we're recording this in the midst of the coronavirus.
And the danger of letting strange old men into your apartment.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. He just bursts in, and Tom Hanks is just like, okay, cool. Also, that scene where the mogul comes into his apartment and they sit down in the living room that's like falling apart. And I was just thinking, like, the night before when Meg Ryan's first character comes in, did she not notice like how much of a shambles his apartment was? Because the angle that we see does not look like that. And then the next day you're like, oh wow,
well, that's
he
the
lives
beauty
in a
of
sty.
having the lights off.
I know, right? But yeah, so let's kind of, because the way that the film is structured with Meg Ryan's three characters, that almost like creates three, like a hard division between the three acts. I don't think her characters necessarily fall into the three acts, but it almost feels that way. Because we start with Joe in his factory job that he hates, and then he kind of gets this, in an ironic sense, this new ticket on life when he finds out that he has a terminal illness. And so he quits his job in a big way and asks the girl at his job out for a date. And the girl there is, Meg Ryan's character there is just like kind of the small thinker, I guess. And that's kind of like epitomizes his life at that time. So it's interesting the way that his interactions with Meg Ryan's characters as he goes through kind of evolve with his own personal growth.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's very unusual for a movie that we are ostensibly pairing with rom-coms. So I feel like it's kind of hard to avoid that comparison, and in many ways, it kind of is a rom-com. But like the first half of the movie is him meeting two women that he's not going to end up with.
Yeah. And the second one is actually a very short portion of the movie.
Yes, it is. It's very tiny. But yeah, actually, you know what? That's an interesting question. Would you call this a rom-com? Because it's certainly an adventure movie. It's just a question of whether or not it fits into that as well.
That I haven't actually thought about it, but I think it does, because almost in a sense, like he is kind of pursuing Meg Ryan the whole time in like a weird meta way. He's just trying, I don't know, like you could kind of go like this weird way, like he's trying to find the right version of the woman that he loves, because he keeps bringing this thing up of, I feel like I met you before. I feel like I knew you before I even knew you, which almost goes into Sleepless in Seattle, the next movie, in this weird kind of, metaphysical way that romance movies can talk about relationships and stuff like that. But I guess it's not technically him pursuing the same character the whole time and them doing this will they, won't they kind of thing, since we don't meet the actual woman that he ends up with until 2/3 of the way through the movie. So I don't know. I don't think I can fall really hard on one side or other of that question.
That's fair. You know what? I will say that the interesting thing about this movie in terms of the acting relationship between the two leads here is that this is, out of the three, this is the only one that feels like there's a single protagonist. In the other two, it's definitely a two-hander. In this one, it's very much about Joe, about Tom Hanks, and Meg Ryan's characters are interesting, but they definitely exist essentially as in relation to Tom Hanks's character.
Mm-hmm. They kind of guide him through his own self-discovery.
Yeah. But at the same time, like the role itself for one actress to play all three seems fascinating, and it actually seems like really like a really fulfilling, interesting role, especially for. Did you say this was her first movie ever? Like her first feature?
No, When Harry Met Sally was her first role.
That's another rom-com classic.
Yeah, right. And another Nora Ephron movie. So Meg Ryan and Nora Ephron go together as well. But we're not there yet. But yeah, so I think this is still fairly early in her career, but it is one of those kind of breakout movies, and definitely an acting showcase for Meg Ryan, definitely.
Yeah, and she does a good job with it, but also like it's kind of nice to see. It feels very evident to me that both her and Tom Hanks just had a lot of fun working together on this movie. This just seems like a really fun movie.
Everyone,
not just
even
to watch,
down to
but just
the people in the office at the beginning of the film, to all of the islanders at the end of the film, like all of these side characters, like it's just a fun, quirky thing that everyone is enjoying putting on. No one feels like they're kind of phoning it in.
Exactly.
You want to marry him? You want to marry her? You're married.
Yeah. The freaking the Islanders are hilarious. Okay, so here's
Yeah.
a question for you,
This is the
Jonathan,
first
'cause
time-
this is relatively minor, but I'm curious what you think of this. The Islanders being descended from a lost Roman ship. Does that make it okay to make fun of them? I don't know.
I think that's the idea, is that it was like they were Romans and Jews and like all of these different ethnicities. So they kind of, make it so that they're not making fun of like truly indigenous people. I think that's kind of like their little script patch for that. But really, I mean, it's basically a stereotype.
Basically.
Yeah. But I will say, like, the orange soda thing is so random.
Oh, yeah.
And this is the first time that I noticed. I think there's only one shot at like the very first time you see them. And the lookout is drinking the orange soda, that I noticed that the soda is called Jump Orange Soda.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, I don't know where that comes from. And I guess it kind of resembles a volcano in the fact that if you shake it up, an orange soda explodes out of it. But it's just kind of there. And apparently it gives these islanders like such a reason to live that none of them are going to jump in the volcano so that they can just keep drinking orange soda. I don't know. It's just, again, it's one of those things that this movie is so over the top that it's just really enjoyable to watch all the way through.
You would think that there would be somebody who's like old or somebody who's really sick on the island who'd just be like, yeah, I'll do it.
Right.
But yeah. Anyway.
They all got to keep drinking their orange soda.
Point.
Which is almost more of an American stereotype.
It is. Did you mention earlier, Jonathan, that the director for this movie was kind of disappointed in this and wanted to move on to something more realistic?
No, that was actually a quote from Tom Hanks, who was talking about the early part of his career. He'd done a lot of kind of over-the-top roles. You probably along the lines of Big and The Burbs and that kind of thing. Yeah, and including this. And so then when he starts moving into films like Sleepless in Seattle, and you've got Mail, and obviously Saving Private Ryan and that kind of thing, that's when he feels like he became a little more grounded as an actor, I guess. And yet a lot of those older over-the-top Tom Hanks movies now have these really big cult followings. Like there are tons of people who love The Burbs. There's a cult following for Joe versus Volcano. I feel like you could show Joe versus Volcano to almost anyone nowadays and they would just kind of like be enchanted by it.
If you enjoy any indie comedy of the past 10 years, you would enjoy Joe versus the Volcano. Easily.
Yeah.
I would be flabbergasted if you didn't. And if you didn't, it might be because it's made in a previous century. Yeah.
And obviously Big still has a big following, even though it's interesting the way that film has aged. But, you know, the fact that it has come back even in films like Shazam, putting it into our modern superhero context, like those films from this era, like in this style, still have this longevity that I don't think anyone thought that they would when they first came out.
Yeah.
So Alex, there are a lot of kind of motifs throughout this film that are really interesting. Like, did you notice the motif with the zigzaggy lightning pattern?
I did not. Where was that?
It's kind of throughout the film, but it's almost one of those things that has to be pointed out or you have to watch the film repeatedly. So at the very beginning, like you said, when they're walking up into the factory, the sidewalk is in this weird zigzaggy pattern. And then that's also, I think, directly superimposed onto a shot of the logo, which is the same. And then in the apartment, when the old man comes to tell him that he's got to go jump in the volcano, the crack in the wall is in the same pattern. And then when the ship gets hit by lightning, the lightning comes down in the same pattern. And then when they're walking up to the volcano, it's the same pattern. It's a really subtle thing, but it's spread out throughout the whole movie. And it's just all these little stylistic things that are so intentional. It's not like this movie is kind of funny with a lot of throwaway jokes. There is a lot of setup and payoff. And I think there's another thing where, like, Meg Ryan at the beginning, her first character, when they're out to dinner, Tom Hanks offers her his hand, and she kind of puts her fist into his hand. And then at the end, her last character, when they're standing on top of the volcano, she offers her hand in a fist, and then it opens up, and then they hold hands. So like these little things, but they're spread out throughout the film, and that intentionality and cohesiveness is another thing that makes this level of stylisticness work. Because if you're doing a bunch of stylistic stuff that feels just thrown in there for no reason, then it doesn't. I don't think that it holds up as well.
That's fair. Yeah, no. If it's all the style, pour as much style as you want onto a thing, as long as it's all relevant or connected in some way. Like
Right.
it just makes the world feel so much more alive than having the generic everyday world be the background. And that's kind of just my opinion, is that the everyday world can be a little boring. And that's also kind of a little bit of a side effect of me having watched a lot of movies and seen so many just based in the everyday world. And not to say that the everyday world can't be made interesting or exciting, but it always takes a little bit of style to get there.
Yeah, because you have to give the audience a reason that they're sitting down and watching your movie. Because if it's the same as their everyday life, then like, what's the point? So there has to be something extraordinary, which also has to be handled carefully because, there's a tension between suspension of disbelief and not being boring. So you have to like ride this line of making it exciting, but not so exciting that you just lose people because they can find no relatability at all in it. And that's, what all movies and all stories throughout time have had to do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting line to walk above a volcano.
And I think the other thing is this film is not just straight gags. Like there are a lot of moments where they kind of sit down and have serious conversations. Like even the second character who's just she's like so ditzy, but she also has like these longings that Tom Hanks kind of taps into, and she never follows up on that. But then with the last character, they have these really deep conversations about what do you want and what is, what are you willing to pay to get what you want and all that kind of stuff. And it is another thing that grounds the film from being so airy that it doesn't have any connection to reality.
Yeah.
What did you think about the what I dubbed the Life of Pi sequence?
The life of where they're stranded on the suitcase?
Yeah.
You know what? I kind of love the suitcase. I kind of love that. That was an interesting moment. That was kind of like a moment for him to fully become this person he's supposed to be, like in action.
That's when he really becomes the hero.
Yeah. And that's I just like that there's this stupid kind of stupid thread about the suitcases that's really relevant throughout the entire movie.
It's literally
also,
the last note of the film.
Yeah, and it's kind of like a hint about like, his future and what he's going to do, and how it's also you can, if you really want to dig into it and be like that kind of like a literary dissecting person, which I'm going to be,
which I do.
It's kind of, this luggage is the thing that goes with you everywhere, and that's kind of like the little speech the luggage guy goes through. And I love the luggage buying scene. He's so ecstatic when he buys. He's so
very interesting
so
as a luggage problem.
He's so ecstatic when he decides on the big suitcase.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like a metaphor for like how Tom Hanks this character, or Joe, is supposed to be moving through life. Like you can go through different places, but don't lose track of who you are. And he started off as the firefighter, and he was a firefighter because that's who he was, and he had to leave it for, I think, medical reasons.
Well, his hypochondria started, so we don't really know what shook him, other than, as the doctor explains, if we can trust him, his constant brushes with death kind of shook his confidence in himself and life in general. He
essentially lost the luggage of who he really is. Like the person who becomes a firefighter is the same kind of hero that we see from Joe at the end of the movie. He literally is willing to jump into a big boiling pit of fire at the end of the movie.
Yeah.
So
For some reason, I never put that together.
He really?
Yeah, I don't know why. The firefighter and jumping into a volcano never connected in my brain till just now.
It kind of makes sense. This is the person he's supposed to be. He lost track of himself, and from the time he gets the luggage, I kind of thought he was going to lose it. He never loses it. He grabs onto it, and he has it through the end of the movie. That's the person he's meant to be.
And that's the last line of the film is, wherever we go, this luggage is going with us.
Which is hilarious, but also, if you're going to look at it from that metaphorical angle, relevant.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I think, unless there's anything else you've got to say about Joe versus the Volcano, we can move on now to Sleepless in Seattle
I think we're ready to move on, yeah.
All right, Jason, take it away.
Sleepless in Seattle from 1993. Sam Baldwin's wife and Jonah Baldwin's mother has died. The two moved to Seattle for a change of scenery. That's when Jonah calls in to a radio help show, tricking his father into talking on air about how he hasn't dated since he's become a widow. Sam comes across as a genuine, sad, and a loving father. The radio show gives him the moniker Sleepless in Seattle, and hundreds of women across the country fall in love with Sam, sending him fan letters which range from sweet to creepy. Meanwhile, across the country, Annie Reed, a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, is engaged to her boyfriend Walter, but feels that something is missing from the relationship. She too falls for Sam when she hears him on the radio, and through her connections as a reporter, she gets closer and closer to meeting him. A cross-country romance seems near impossible. Perhaps time, convenience, and the willingness to dream when it comes to romance can overcome the challenge.
The very first shot in this film is actually like a really subtly genius shot. I love that shot.
Is it the one? It's the one at the graveyard?
Yeah, the one that starts with just Tom Hanks and his son, and you're looking kind of up this hill and you just see the sky behind them, and then it cranes up so that Chicago starts just looming up out of the background, and then it pulls out and you see all the rest of the mourners at his wife's funeral. That movement is so nice, as it starts with isolated on just them and the casket to the whole city coming up, because location is very important in this film, and then all the mourners, and then, that in itself is just so much exposition in the first 10 seconds of this film. It's incredible.
Yeah, no, it is really cool. And there's this whole thing running through the movie that's hit on a little hard with the map that we keep seeing throughout the movie.
Yes, the map is repetitive.
But it's definitely about geography in a way, and this long distance thing, and this kind of like idea of fate and what city we're supposed to be in, where they move from Chicago to Seattle, and then our female protagonist, because I can never remember names in these rom-coms because they're all so generic.
They're just types.
What is Tom? I hate Tom Hanks's character's name in this movie. I don't remember it for the life of me.
Oh, it's the only one that's not Joe.
It's not Joe, and it's he's Joe Fox, and You've Got Mail. You're right.
Yeah.
Joe Fox is at least like a little bit of an interesting movie,
it's
and
catchy,
it's tied into the bookstore too. His name in this movie is just so generic. It makes me want to be upset about how generic it is. Sorry, that's terrible. It's so frustrating. Anyway, Meg Ryan's character starts off in Baltimore, and she moves to New York, and it's this will they, they won't they, which is interesting. The geography back and forth.
Sam.
There we go.
Sam Baldwin.
God, that's so boring. But I mean, what is the point of his name being so dry? Anyway.
Oh my gosh. You know what it could be? The opening titles of this film are what's it called? A Kiss is Still a Kiss As Time Goes By, which is played by Sam in Casablanca. Maybe a connection there. Just throwing that out there.
I guess that's possible.
Because they do reference Casablanca like one other time in the film.
Yeah. Well, the geography is an interesting point of this film, but I feel like the thing that is the big concept in this movie is, what if we tell a rom-com, but kind of like in reverse. And by in reverse, I don't mean they fall out of love. I mean the characters meet at the end of the movie. And we spend the movie just really exploring them as people and establishing why these two people specifically should be together, which actually makes this kind of like a really interesting like dual character study of a movie, which I think is probably what makes it so good. And then it comes through at the end with a few near misses starting about halfway through the movie. When
a couple not misses that are misses.
Yes. Yeah. They start seeing, they actually start physically seeing each other. And he doesn't realize that she's his stalker, basically, because that's what she is. Not to be rude about it, but she is his stalker.
Yeah. I'm going to try to not be too cynical about this movie, but I definitely picked up on that too. Cause there is a lot of stuff that, almost has to work in, I don't want to like put this label on it, but you almost have to do this rom-com logic thing. And it's something that the film brings up in this whole thread of like the Cary Grant thing, where it's just a thing that exists, where there's someone that you're supposed to be with and fate keeps you apart or brings you together, and all of these things that are accidental. And the film acknowledges it and then does it several times.
Yeah, which actually makes it really interesting. And this is actually kind of like sort of Nora Ephron's signature in a way. Like she likes to do this thing where it's a rom-com, but it's not your standard rom-com, which makes all of her movies really interesting. When Harry Met Sally, which we already mentioned, that is a hardcore rom-com, but it doesn't feel like a rom-com at the very start. And then You've Got Mail, which again is a rom-com, but is kind of very similar to Sleepless in Seattle in that the characters don't realize that they're in a rom-com until partways or in different points in the movie that are far past the beginning.
And they write to each other.
Yeah. You went and watched Shop Around a Corner, right?
I had seen it a couple months ago before we watched these movies. And In the Good Old Summertime, which have you seen that one?
I have not seen that one.
Okay. Well, we'll get into that when we talk about You've Got Mail, because that is the in-between adaptation of Shop Around the Corner. The musical adaptation, actually. The Sleepless in Seattle has like all of these motifs, and it points out the motifs, so it has this meta thread running through it, and it knows that it's kind of pulling on your heartstrings as it goes through. And I think there's this really interesting thing. Another kind of parallel between Sleepless in Seattle and You've Got Mail is the way that Nora Ephron points out films as kind of this gendered kind of gender role breakup of movies, because in this film there is an affair to remember thread where every woman in the film is in love with an affair to remember, which kind of helps Meg Ryan get through a lot of stuff because it's a relatability point. And then in You've Got Mail, there's the Godfather thing that's like every guy loves the Godfather and knows all the references to it. And even in this one, they bring up like the Dirty Dozen as like the guy's An Affair to Remember with the tragic ending, which I think is really interesting for someone who directs a lot of rom-com movies and knows that, at least in the way that she's pointing out, there's a predominantly female audience for these types of movies. And so there's so much kind of like meta thread running through all of this stuff.
Yeah, no, there is a heavy meta thread through this whole movie, which kind of makes it fun because it's meant to be a rom-com for rom-com lovers about a rom-com lover.
It's not something that like takes you out of the movie.
No.
Because it's also a natural thing to talk about rom-coms when you're talking about your love life.
And Meg Ryan's character is very aware of it too. She's like, am I in a rom-com right now? In a much less cheesy way than I just said it, obviously. But essentially that's kind of the point. That's part of the fun of the movie. That is still fun and entertaining and exciting for the audience, but not distracting because it's very relevant to what the plot of the movie and the story of these characters.
So yeah, I kind of want to zero in on Meg Ryan's character because Tom Hanks is, he's got a pretty standard kind of arc as far as going from grief to trying to find love, and it's not quite right, and the son doesn't really agree. And we've kind of seen that kind of thing before. But then Meg Ryan's character goes through this stalker thing and this, again, kind of this emotional infidelity thing, almost like we talked about with Lost in Translation.
Yeah.
And it's this whole thing where she's trying to find out if maybe she's making the wrong choice before she has made it. And that takes it to this places that on their face are kind of odd, where she follows him to his house and watches him. And then these moments that have become cliches at this point, where Tom Hanks will see her and then like the world stops and the romantic music plays and all that kind of thing. But it all goes into, since there is such a thread of fate and stuff like that, you kind of are sucked into this idea that, they are meant to be together, and all of these things build that up. And yet looking at it on paper, you're like, I don't think people are supposed to do that to each other. Although nowadays you just kind of throw it into a Facebook stalking kind of a scene, and that's actually way more prevalent than hopefully stalking someone that you were interested in from far away was back before Facebook existed.
Hopefully.
Hopefully.
Gosh,
I don't know.
No, I don't know how I feel. At least in this movie, like her being in a relationship at the start of the movie makes sense because it's part of her arc. Like, she doesn't realize that she's looking for something exciting at the top of the movie. It's not only until much later in that she realizes what's wrong with her current relationship and that she made decisions that weren't in her best interest that ended up with her in that relationship. And they kind of made it easy on the audience by having like a really friendly breakup scene too.
Yeah, and that happens in this movie and You've Got Mail that I kind of want to talk about, but I don't.
Yeah,
I'm trying really hard not to be cynical.
I have very different opinions on the breakup in You've Got Mail. Or the fact that they're even in relationships at the start of You Got Mail.
Especially knowing the origin of that story.
Yeah. But I'm going to save that discussion for the next section, so this is all more evened out structurally, and that you guys have a reason to keep listening.
Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. You'll never know. Guess what happens on the second half of The Filmlings?
Okay, but let's talk about this for a second, because this is, I feel like a general rom-com thing. But tell me, Alex, what is wrong with Meg Ryan's relationship in this movie? Her initial relationship.
She has essentially gone down a path that she thinks she's supposed to go down. And in her interest to go down that path, she has neglected to look for what she really wants in a person, and has therefore ended up in essentially the easiest option for a relationship with this guy who, at least in her eyes and her view, because I like to take into account that all of their scenes kind of happen very subjectively from her point of view and from this movie's point of view, is way too boring for her. Way too plain, way too safe. And she needs a little risk and adventure in her life. And then she hears this person who she's connecting to over radio, and she goes out on that limb and goes and does something crazy and absurd, kind of like the crazy and absurd things that happen in An Affair to Remember, which is go essentially stalk this guy. And it definitely has, it is decidedly a form of infidelity, but it matches up with her obsession with An Affair to Remember.
Yes. Okay, so here's my thing, because I mean, I definitely agree that if you are having second thoughts before you get engaged, that you should call it off before the actual marriage. But I feel like there is nothing
Yeah,
inherent.
marriage is not a line you want to cross with the thought in your head of it might get better.
Absolutely.
That's such
But
a
I
bad
feel
call.
like the reasons for calling off this engagement are not strong enough, or they're not strongly enough built, or at least they're kind of like the fact that he snores and is allergic to stuff.
I had to do a lot of work right now to construct
Okay, thanks.
the story that I just did. Like I essentially constructed
you're
it
defending the film
based on I that was a view of I've seen this multiple times, and that's the reason that I've kind of had to construct in my own head to explain it. Because otherwise, in terms of the filmmaking, there isn't a lot.
So can we agree that in real
this.
life, if your only issues with a relationship are the fact that a guy snores and has allergies, are not very good reasons to break off a relationship?
Yeah, no, as portrayed, that those reasons don't make a lot of sense, and those are very directly portrayed as as kind of like the moments where she's having dissatisfaction with her current relationship.
Because there's nothing like inherently more risky or more exciting about Sam in this film, because she doesn't know anything about
and Sam himself is
Sam's life.
Sam himself is kind of like a little boring. I'm just going to throw it out there.
Yeah, he's not any more exciting than her current relationship, except the fact that she would have to start over and discover this new guy, whereas she's already, very comfortable. Every scene she has with her fiance, they have a great time, and he loves her a lot, and,
essentially she just isn't in love with him.
Yeah.
And she instead of coming to that realization, she kind of goes through this process of stalking some dude she heard on the radio, which is not healthy. And it's not a cute way in it all to describe what's going on in this movie.
So probably this is the best thing for her fiance, but I don't know that it's necessarily the best thing just in general. And I know this is probably like, oh my gosh, guys don't get rom-coms and stuff like that. And
I feel like a lot of this too, I feel like there are definitely, I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'm going to say the majority of women have been in a relationship that on paper looks like it makes complete sense, looks safe, looks like they should be interested, but they just aren't for whatever reason. They just find it boring, but they're still moving along because they can't find the reason to get out of it. And I feel like that would automatically connect to a lot of women who watch this movie.
That's true.
And heck,
I just feel like she didn't
a lot
feel.
Of men.
Yeah, no, and I agree, but I feel like in all the scenes that we see them in, like they connect really well. They have like this great. So maybe it is kind of like this internal thing that just doesn't really come out externally that much, except for when she decides to go chase some other guy that she only heard on the radio. Which again goes into this whole like rom-com logic thing. So like as long as the film has set up this this logic well enough at the very beginning, then you can kind of go along with some of these things. But I kind of just had to play, devil's advocate a little bit during like trying to justify her for myself. But I think Meg Ryan does a really good job of portraying this kind of internal turmoil that she's having. Like when she's reacting to the radio, that's a really emotional thing. It's just there's a lot of cynicism in my own head that kind of makes me have to work a lot harder to get to that same place with her.
That's fair. And I would say, this is definitely one of those movies where the most interesting thing is having your expectations of what a rom-com is be subverted. Like that's a very interesting and exciting thing about this. And the characters' journeys as individuals seems very interesting. And then, of course, the tension is built just wonderfully because it's this entire guessing game of when are they going to meet. Because I can only imagine seeing this for the first time back in 1993?
93, yeah.
Wow, that's a long time ago. Expecting, like you're 5 minutes into the movie. Oh, they haven't met yet. Maybe they'll meet in 5 minutes from now. And then essentially 5 minutes after that being like, why haven't they met yet? Why haven't they met yet? Why haven't they met yet?
Yeah.
And then you get to the airport where they first like kind of see each other for a second and you're like, oh, they're going to meet. Nope. Oh, they're going to meet. Oh, they've seen each other. Oh, nope. They're still not going to talk.
Yeah. And then they just like wrench it in with the elevator switcheroo at the very end.
Oh yeah. No, it finally happens at the very end of the movie. And that's kind of where the movie
first
ends.
they have to drive one more little wedge in it where he goes down in the elevator and she comes out of the elevator 2 seconds later. And you're like, oh, of course they haven't met. And then eventually, not to get it, like, not that I haven't just spoiled the whole thing, but not to go all the way.
part of it is, whatever. I think they literally played the Frank Sinatra song, "Whatever Will Be Will Be." Like, it's very much about fate. That's a heavy theme in it. It's very much about who you're meant to be with. It's very much about perseverance in a way. It's an interesting movie for that reason. I actually, one of my favorite story arcs of this whole movie is, and I think maybe my favorite story arc is between Sam, the generically named Sam Baldwin, and his son, who's also generically named.
Yes, I was about to bring up the son because he did great, Jonah.
Yeah, they have a fascinating relationship with the son being ready to move on and trying to encourage his dad to date again, and the dad not being ready, and then the dad goes out and picks just someone who's just really safe. They seem to have some fun together, but
he also seems kind of desperate.
He does, and he kind of just seems like he just wants to do it, like he just wants to get. And I don't mean the sex. I just mean.
They kind of bring that up.
That is a scene in the movie, not the sex, but wanting to have sex and then getting cock blocked by your son. But you're going to have to censor this entire section. I'm sorry. But
I mean, there's no other way to talk about it. That's how it comes up in the movie.
That's specifically what happened.
They're pretty blatant about it in the movie.
And that's literally the joke. But he's just kind of eager to be like, well, hey, everybody wants me to be in a relationship again. That's what'll make me happy, right? And so he just does it. He just gets a relationship, but not one that he seems very interested in or that anybody else seems very excited by or he seems very excited by. It just kind of is.
Can we bring up this fun little tidbit about Rob Reiner being in this movie?
Oh, he is in this movie. Are you talking about Tom Hanks's bus story?
Well, yeah, but I mean, just the fact that last time we saw Rob Reiner was when we did I don't remember if we did Spinal Tap first or Princess Bride first, but Rob Reiner, who's known for directing This Is Spinal Tap and Princess Bride, shows up as an actor in this film as Tom Hanks's buddy at the construction site. And then, they have this fun conversation about how women like guys' butts, and Rob Reiner has to check out Tom Hanks's butt. So there's that in this movie.
Every friend needs a friend who can tell them whether or not their butt looks good.
Yeah, that's the real test of true friendship.
That's the real test of friendship.
That's the moral of this story. That's what we're gonna leave Sleepless in Seattle on. Are you ready to move on to our last film, Alex?
I am.
All right, cool. So, Jason, set up You've Got Mail for us.
You've Got Mail.
From 1998. Kathleen Keeley runs a children's bookshop that's been owned by her family for generations. She's also been exchanging email correspondence with a mysterious gentleman online for quite some time, and the two seem to have fallen for each other. Joe Fox is the third-generation owner and operator of Fox Books, a big-box bookstore that's known for putting smaller independent stores out of business. He's been exchanging emails with a mysterious woman online for quite some time and seems to have fallen for her. The two live in the same neighborhood, talk to each other nearly every day, and have no clue what the other looks like. But when a Fox bookstore is set to open next to Kathleen's little shop, the business enemies and secretly in love pair are set on a collision course that will change their lives entirely.
All right, Alex, so The Shop Around the Corner is your fourth favorite film. So why don't you get us started with You've Got Mail? which I believe is the most recent adaptation of that story.
Unless somebody else has done like a tweet thing or like a Finsta thing. Do you know what a Finsta is, Jonathan?
I do not.
It's what the kids do these days, apparently. Although I've only heard about it because I've heard other old people like us talk about what the kids do these days. So if it is a thing that kids ever did, it was done like 3 years ago and it's probably stopped by now. But it's called a fake Instagram, where it's not your real Instagram. But it would be some absurd social media adaptation of the story. But this is the most recent that I know of. And it's pretty good compared to The Shop Around the Corner. But The Shop Around the Corner is just excellent. It was done by Ernst Lubitsch, who is, by the way, one of the masters of comedy. And one of the original auteurs that's often discussed by the French New Wave, people who define the term. And even before they defined the term, there was something that was well known in the industry during the golden age of the studio system, known as the Lubitsch touch, which was his special style, his special way of doing comedy that only he could do, that brought to a movie that made it feel both like wholesome and moral and funny at the same time, even when dealing with some of the darkest or, deep personal set issues of the characters.
Yeah, we'll have to do a Lubitsch episode at some point on the podcast.
I've been dying to do one for a long time. But yes, he is amazing, and The Shop Around the Corner with Jimmy Stewart is amazing. And I think, indisputably, unless you really just want to get in an argument with me one day, that it is better than You've Got Mail.
Oh yeah, no, I'm not going to argue with that. And I think there's interesting that I'll probably just bring this up. So I'll preface that in between You've Got Mail and Shop Around the Corner, there was another adaptation of the story called In the Good Old Summertime, which may or may not still be on Criterion in the MGM musicals section, because it is a musical adaptation.
It's a musical.
The shop is turned into like a music shop. So they have instruments, and Judy Garland, who stars in the film alongside some other guy, it's pretty close to The Shop Around the Corner in a way that You've Got Mail is a little more kind of loosely adapted. It doesn't have the same cast of characters. They're not working together, all that kind of stuff. And also, fun fact about In the Good Old Summertime, it features Buster Keaton, whose sole purpose is to deliver a plot point by falling down. So there's that. And that was in the 60s. So Buster Keaton is 50s or 60s. Buster Keaton is past his prime in that film, I'll say, which is a little sad to see, but also it was kind of nice just to see him in there. Go Buster Keaton. But yeah, so the Shop Around You've Got Mail throws a lot of nods to Shop Around the Corner. So if you've seen You've Got Mail, you know that Meg Ryan's bookstore is called The Shop Around the Corner.
It's very direct.
I think the first thing we should probably start this discussion off with is the changing of letters to email/IM. Alex, how well does that translate?
I don't know. And part of it is because of when I was born.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. It's the way they IM is so different than the way we text. Not just as individuals, but I mean like as a generation, as a group, like the way we communicate via text and language. And then going all the way back to like the, full out like pieces of literature that were being churned out by people in full on letter form.
Yeah.
And Shop Around the Corner. Like the letters that are being written in the Shop Around the Corner are beautiful. And the IMs in this one just cannot hold up. And you know what? I'm just going to throw this on there too. For some reason, the way Tom Hanks's character reads his emails, and this is probably based on like who the character is, makes him sound like such a douche. It's so hard to connect.
Yeah, there's actually like a really good direct parallel there's a line in Shop Around the Corner that comes up a couple times where Jimmy Stewart receives a letter, I believe, from the love interest who has written, I take you from the mailbox and I open your envelope and take you out and see the words printed on the page in your handwriting, is really eloquent, much more eloquent than I just said. And it doesn't come across the same way when Meg Ryan is saying, I open up my email and I see the notification that I have an IM from you.
There's some stuff in there about her being really excited to get to get the email, but it just doesn't ring the same. And then of course we do have to mention that both of them are in kind of not just banal, but like kind of irrelevant relationships at the start of this movie.
Totally.
Like
it's
they
literally
have
just
nothing to do with
fodder
who they are as
for
people.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do with the story, and it has nothing to do with the plot.
Tom Hanks' girlfriend disappears halfway through the film. At least there's a resolution with Meg Ryan's boyfriend.
Well, she kind of comes back and gets broken up with, but she just comes back to get broken up with. They don't
she
even
has
show
like
the breakup.
2 scenes.
Yeah, and then
I thought this would be, I feel like this would be more interesting, but maybe it's too obvious. I thought that their boyfriend, girlfriend were going to get together at some point, because the point when they meet at the social gathering, she's like, Tom Hanks's girlfriend talks to Meg Ryan's boyfriend, who's a journalist or whatever, and she's like, oh, I've read your articles, they're so interesting, blah blah blah. And I was like, oh, okay, so they're gonna get together. And then that didn't even happen.
That would have been so interesting.
Yeah,
or at least more interesting than like what happened. Like Meg Ryan's boyfriend is there to write an article.
He hates technology too, which did not age well at all.
Yeah, no, it was really silly.
Where he's like obsessed with typewriters and which is a form of technology. He's like only interested in very specific forms of technology. He thinks that computers are stupid, but typewriters are perfect machinery. And it just doesn't work anymore if it ever did.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's pretty brutal. It's also kind of like darkly humorous to me that this is all done in the print industry in 1998. And they're like, this, what's the future of the print industry going to be? Are there going to be big stores, or the big stores are the bad guys? And now it's like any bookstore is miraculous.
Yeah, right.
Although they've carved themselves out like a nice little niche. It's not like they're the bookstores that are around now.
No, they're not irrelevant or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think at the point we're at now, like the bookstore analogy still kind of works, and the big business versus the indie business still works. It's just the technology thing, and especially like in the 90s when people were so like infatuated with technology, and yet it was like the only thing people talked about was whether it was good or not. Like, so at this point, kind of bringing up whether we should be using technology or not is such a moot point that it doesn't really hold up as any kind of driving plot point. And I think kind of just to put a cap on the technology thing, like, what you're getting into at the very beginning of this film when the terrible 3D rendering of New York shows up, and we kind of fly through this low poly version of New York.
Gosh.
I assume was like
it's so
cutting
dated.
edge. Yeah, I assume it was cutting edge in 98, but
it must have been. It had to have been.
Yeah, it does not hold up. I mean, 98 is actually it's several years after Toy Story. So like we're getting there. We've made 3D animated movies, but that just putting that at the very start of the film kind of lets you know that, okay, this is a technology thing that you're going to have to look past for the rest of the movie.
Yeah. No, it's very dated. It's very dated, but not in a good way. Not in a good way. So like when you watch Shop Around a Corner, you've got this lovely feel of this is a different time period. This is a different place. This is kind of like this more romantic existence in a way. Not that it necessarily was, but in a way you can
Yeah.
imagine it. It's part of the trapping of what it is, part of the style of what it is. Even for the time, it probably felt a little old-fashioned, but this just feels
It's a
stale.
romanticized. Yeah. Okay, Alex, here's the thing. Okay, we're going to harp on this little technology thing for a second because there's a way to do it that works. For example, I think Baby Driver is a really good example of how to use dated technology in a way that doesn't feel dated because the
Shuffles?
iPods in that, yeah, the iPod shuffles in that like work as an icon almost more than a literal piece of technology. Whereas using AOL and the dial-up tone doesn't. I feel like if it wasn't specifically AOL, but some generic messaging platform, it would have a little bit more longevity. But they like went full on like showing the latest technology that it was at the time. And anytime you show the specific technology that we have, it doesn't last more than, 5 years if you're lucky at this point.
Yeah. Nah, it's all built to fail. But it's changing so fast.
You have to just do something generic that doesn't really exist and gets the idea across in order for it to still hold
distill
up.
it down to like the culture behind the technology. Like each technology develops a culture around it, like a set of habits and such. And I feel like we don't really get that about IMs in this one. Like you get something about the letters in Shop Around the Corner. Yes, my entire analysis of this movie, my side of it, is going to be comparing it to Shop Around the Corner. I'm sorry.
No, I'm there
but
with
I'm not
you.
really sorry. Part of, it embraces the culture of letter writing, the fact that it's anonymous, the fact that it's about how you write, the handwriting, the mystery of it, is all.
Even I think they bring up the tears on the page at some point in that movie.
Yeah, the physical medium, the artifact, the fact that you can carry it around with you. It's all very, very, very connected to the movie and to these characters and to their story and how the letter writing is portrayed. This one, you don't get. I feel like they missed out by not showing a culture of IMing. No one else in this movie seems to be sending emails or IMing at all. It's only
Because
our
it's
two
looked
main
down upon.
characters.
The only other person who brings it up is the boyfriend who thinks that it's dumb.
Yeah, but wouldn't it have been so good if someone else was doing it in secret as well, and then that was revealed as part?
I guess that's true. No, the only other thing I can think of is at the beginning when her friend at the shop, they all start talking about cybersex and their experiences with that, which kind of goes into another point.
Thing.
I know.
I'm not saying no one ever did it. I'm just saying there's no way that was actually like a consistent thing.
Yeah, it's just something that I kind of want to bring up, this idea that there are moments like that I feel like are put in there exclusively to make the film feel like kind of cutting edge and modern, like talking about cybersex and talking about the American family, about how his dad and his grandfather both had really weird relationships and are constantly in and out of relationships, which I feel like doesn't help the fact that they both are in really weird relationships and then have to get out of them in order to get into the relationship that they're in right now. Like, it's one of those things where it doesn't make me feel very confident about the relationship that they end up with at the end. But there are a lot of these little things that they just feel like we got to update this for, the modern type of relationship and the modern love story. And yet I don't feel like it works. Again, like in this, coming from a really classically romantic type of a story, it feels forced, I guess.
Yeah. I don't think this movie gets truly interesting until the very end of the film, like the last act,
when
the
he
last
starts
30 minutes, when he shows
courting her.
from the moment he shows up at her door with a bunch of flowers in his hand,
she has
knowing
a cold.
everything he knows, and she, not practicing correct self-isolation techniques, lets him in to
There's
possibly
a lot of COVID relatability in these movies.
It's
ironically.
impossible to avoid. This is actually that him going in there is how he got COVID. It's just been sitting in his system for 20 years, and it's finally popped out now. More than 20 years.
I can't
this movie
even
came out
watch
23 years ago.
Yeah, I can't even watch people touching their faces in these movies without thinking about germs now.
Oh gosh, the face touching thing,
even though it's such a normal thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But no, I totally agree with you. Like that, that's one of those things where it sort of feels creepy that now you could argue manipulating her with his letters because he has more knowledge than her at that point, and yet he does it in a very romantic way. And I feel like that you're right. That part is really interesting to see how he's going to lead up to this moment. And if we had spent more time on that, and again, like just the shifting of who knows what in a film is always really interesting. So from the moment in both of the stories, whatever part of the basics of Shop Around the Corner, the story, that moment where he learns who she is and she doesn't changes the dynamics. And it's one of the most interesting parts of the film that make it such a compelling story.
That's a
that
really
stood
good
the
scene
test
too.
of time. Yeah. And that scene is really easy to update. But then, what happens after that is definitely more interesting than what happens beforehand. And in the original Shop Around the Corner, there's another part like that where there's shifting of information with the affair. And that is something that has been dropped from this movie, almost because affairs are like a flippant thing that's thrown around. But so we're kind of left with that one shifting of him learning that she's the pen pal and how he progresses from there. That's like our main plot hinge that the movie stands or falls by, basically.
Yeah. And that's the most interesting part of the whole movie. Everything before that feels, I don't want to say generic, but almost a little generic.
Stereotypical.
Anyway, I'm gonna go on a totally random tangent, Jonathan, just to defend Joe versus the Volcano again, and it's stylized nature. Because I went on this big rant earlier about how some movies are in this stylized world and some are in the quote unquote real world. I think if you take one look at You've Got Mail, you'd say it's set in the real world, right? Mm-hmm. Except every movie that's supposedly set in the real world has to make judgment calls about it. They have to essentially stylize it in their own way. In this movie, they have to make a call. Is cheating viewed at passively in this movie, or is it viewed at as something serious? Is this infidelity real or serious? Is the book industry something that's very important and relevant to the world of this movie, or is it not? Mm-hmm. They're making all these style choices within this real world setting. So it doesn't matter what the setting of your movie is. It's always going to be stylized. It's just the question of how much you take. But they're more philosophical
than aesthetic.
True. It just matters how much you're going to do it.
Yeah, because there's not a strong aesthetic style. And I think that's one of the things that sets Joe versus the Volcano apart as a stylized movie is visually it is stylized, which helps us accept the philosophical and thematic stylization. But those philosophical and thematic stylizations do exist in other films, just in more subdued and nuanced ways, especially if they don't have that visual stylization to help carry that along.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move into overall notes and talk about, I guess, first of all, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan as an on-screen couple. And this being their entire run of films together, how does their chemistry work together? Obviously, it worked enough to bring them back together for several films, even after their first one was on a box office side, a flop, basically.
They definitely really liked each other, like offset or off screen. Like they genuinely got along, like they're good friends. Meg Ryan eventually, as we know, stepped away from movie making for quite some time. But during their run together, they seemed to really enjoy working together. and that kind of translates on screen. It's the perfect sort of chemistry kind of for a rom-com where there's genuine affection, but also like this level of friendship and humor to it. It's definitely not like sultry or sparky or passionate chemistry on screen or anything like that, but the perfect amount of affection and chemistry for the rom-com aesthetic.
Yeah, just like good solid friendship. Basically,
Fun,
like in
wholesome.
Yeah, and in Joe versus the Volcano, they're basically on good terms throughout the film in all of the characters that they play together. And then Sleepless in Seattle, they actually barely interact with each other.
There's a lot of looking.
That physical like chemistry is less of a player in that film. They're just like kind of standing on their own individual acting chops, which are more than sufficient. And then in You've Got Mail, they get to play a little bit more of the fun rivalry where they start off as, being against each other and literally competing with each other while also falling in love with each other at the same time over their voiceovers. And then by the end, again, they had that whole scene of him bringing her flowers and trying to make amends while she has a cold is such a fun scene to watch. Like her just, being in that mode that we can all relate to. And again, it's taken on a different tone nowadays, but just being completely under the weather.
It's a little creepy, but what kind of makes it work for me is there's that part later in the movie where, and of course this is after they've been courting for some time, where it's just where she goes, "I was hoping it was you," after he's been revealed. That kind of makes it okay, and I think even though she hated his guts, she kind of also felt this interest in him and kind of had a bit of a crush on him even before that, because otherwise what the romance and the courtship that we see later wouldn't work at all. But
I think just like, again, that scene where she's feeling completely under the weather and just feels gross and he is doing everything to be charming. I think Tom Hanks's personality is the perfect way to make that work and put us on their team together, as opposed to it being like a creepy thing, like she's not all there and he's coming on to her, because it doesn't come off that way at all. It comes off as like he's very gentlemanly, and even though they had the last scene I think that they were in together, they had this big argument that kind of drove them apart. He's turning it around and using that scene being that pivotal point works because the two of them worked together really well and performed that just the way that it needed to be performed.
Exactly. Okay, Jonathan, so what do you have to say about Nora Ephron?
Yeah, so these are, I want to say, Nora Ephron's done several other rom-coms. I have not seen all of them. I have not seen When Harry Met Sally. Shame on me. I will get.
That's a big one, man. That's a big one.
I know.
Have you seen Bewitched?
Play it straight with me. Am I going to be too cynical to watch that movie?
No.
Okay.
No, you're not.
And I think I've seen parts of Bewitched, but I'm not sure if I've seen all of Bewitched.
When Harry Met Sally, she wrote.
She just wrote it? Oh,
yeah,
okay.
She wrote it. It was directed by Rob Reiner.
Oh, that's appropriate.
Yeah, but she's actually kind of like a little more, and by little I mean way more prolific as a writer than she is as a director. And we do kind of know that's a symptom of the time when she was working, or I guess still work. No, unfortunately she passed away.
Oh, she did. Yeah, and I haven't seen Julie and Julia yet either. I need to do that because that was her last film that she both wrote and directed. So I can't speak very broadly of Nora Ephron's career, but I think it is interesting knowing that she definitely knows the genre that she's working in, and she knows the beats to hit and the ways to pull it off, because the two films that she directed in our episode today are the two most financially successful films out of the three. Even if, they all kind of hold up differently than they were initially received. And I think, again, it's interesting. Like, she knows what genre she's working in, and she knows that genre has a specific effect on people. Again, in the way that she brings up films in her own films that kind of epitomize the way that men and women think. Like the way that Affair to Remember is brought up throughout Sleepless in Seattle, and The Godfather is brought up throughout You've Got Mail. Even though The Godfather has significantly less to do with the plot and themes of You've Got Mail than An Affair to Remember did in Sleepless in Seattle. But it's like that almost tips us off to the way that she thinks about genre, and she thinks about the films that she is making in the broader context of the culture that films are received in. And that self-awareness, I think, is always really interesting in a director.
Yeah. I like how much she essentially plays with the meta level of all of her rom-coms. Nothing is quite the standard setup of a rom-com, especially the big three that we're all mentioned in the podcast today, even though we technically didn't do When Harry Met Sally, although we've basically talked about it so much that we kind of did, except Jonathan hasn't seen the movie, which is still so strange to me.
I know. It's just one of those movies.
But all three of those are not your standard rom-com plot, which is interesting and unique. And she actually achieves something quite brilliant in all three of them. Even if like the technology remake angle of You've Got Mail is a little, is almost kind of like a little tedious, especially 23 years later on, once technology's changed so much. But it's not so far that it's like, oh, this is from a different era. All right, Jonathan. So we have not really talked, I think, at least over the course of a whole episode, about romantic comedies before on the podcast.
I'm trying to think. I mean, we've hit screwball comedies pretty a couple times.
Often the considered the predecessor of the modern rom-com, which actually, as a movie genre, has kind of died.
Right.
Not fully.
Probably
it's just,
like
they're not mainstream. They're not the big blockbusters anymore, because big blockbusters are all action, adventure, superhero, or horror these days.
And as we've talked about, almost, things like What's Up, Doc are almost like the farewell letter to classic screwball comedies.
Yeah. And then we kind of entered this era over the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s where there was the rom-com, and the rom-com became essentially like the chick flick. That's what it's called.
Yeah.
Often derisively, because it was built very specifically to appeal to female audiences. And I guarantee you that's specifically what the studios thought. They probably loved that term, or loved that term.
Because they love putting movies in boxes.
Oh, yeah. They love it. It makes it marketable. They enjoyed it quite a bit.
And they understand it. Studios don't like things they don't understand.
This is also true. I mean, look how long it's taken them to adjust to the internet. But this is kind of became, I think the really derisive part of it was that it kind of became a little, it became considered sappy. It became considered kind of formulaic in a way.
Yeah. A lot of it started to hit the same stereotypes and fall into the same, hitting the same notes over and over again in slightly different situations.
Yeah,
which all genres are prone to, which is why, even like the stigma that sci-fi and horror films still fall into is just being called genre films. And even though I don't think rom-coms fall into quote unquote genre films as most people understand it, that's kind of the place that they've gotten to by being labeled rom-coms. That's like the term genre for romantic films.
Yeah, no. But
it
that's
automatically gives you an idea of what it is.
Yeah, and you know what? The opposite, or the genre at its height is often one that kind of ends up subverting its idea of itself. And very specifically, the works of Nora Ephron that we've been talking about this episode. Those are the ones that kind of stick out in my head the most. I'm trying to think of other classic rom-coms, except this is just not my forte. Oh my gosh.
I know.
I feel like I need to go watch a bunch of rom-coms during this lockdown, Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good a time as any to catch up on missed genres, because it's definitely a genre that I have probably the least experience with and just the least broad knowledge of. That and maybe like supernatural horror too. But it's one of those that, like, all the things we've been talking about today, I'm sure people who are very familiar with the romantic comedy genre or the romantic genre in general will have a lot to contradict with us and a lot to kind of take umbrage at our approach to these. But I think part of it is just us being a little bit fresher to the genre and less experienced with it. And I mean, there's still, definitely my thoughts as I'm going through these films, but it's also my thoughts going through these films without a ton of reference points to them.
Yeah, exactly. Gosh, now I'm just stuck thinking about like all the rom-coms I'm going to have to watch now.
Yeah, and they'll come back on the show. I mean, romance is not something that's been absent from the show, but romantic comedy in itself is definitely a little bit lacking. I mean, like one of our very first episodes was Pride and Prejudice, which doesn't fall in that genre, but I'm just saying, like, we've hit on
I don't know.
romance
Jane
and
Austen,
rom-com
it
in
can
and
also
out.
easily
Jane Austen
be
is
called
hilarious.
the originator of the romantic comedy.
I completely agree with that. Her writing is absolutely genius and hilarious,
And not something that was really done before her, at least not in any kind of like widely published manner, just because women didn't have the same kind of publicized voices. Even in Jane Austen's era, it was, I mean, obviously it was groundbreaking, it was different, it was very, very rare.
Jane Austen has a whole book about how romance novels are looked down upon in Northanger Abbey.
As the chick flicks of the literary world.
Northanger Abbey has so much commentary about the chick flicks of their own day,
which is kind of important to why why they were, or I guess they still are. It's just not, I say were because they're just not nearly as prevalent. But why they were considered chick flicks of the day, it was a female originated genre. And I think most of the really successful rom-coms had women either involved in them in large major ways or completely headed by women. Either directed or written or something like that. And I think that says a lot about the qualities of the genre that were filling in gaps in the industry that were not being supported in any other way, shape, or form.
Because it's a perspective that wasn't there.
Yeah. There's kind of like this interesting genre in the 30s and the early 40s. I think it's called just women films. It's a very blasé
like
term.
George Cukor type.
Yes,
like we talked about George Cukor films,
and it's literally.
And I think Lubitsch fits in there.
Stories almost entirely written and created by men, told about women to appeal to women audiences because women were the deciders about what you went to see when you went to the movies. And a lot of them are not
so
that
many
good.
Great films came out of. Well, I mean, a lot of really good ones did. I mean, you think of George Cukor's films. You think of like probably a lot of screwball comedies kind of fall into that genre as well. So even like Philadelphia Story, All About Eve. Like there are a lot of
screwball comedies, and the female film essentially just had to have a baby together to get rom-coms.
Yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of overlap there, and nobody was thinking in those terms when they were coming out. But this is kind of like the evolution of that, and I feel like there's a difference in the type of humor and the I don't want to say like level of sophistication, because there are definitely those films that kind of get elevated out of the quote unquote genre realm. And that, again, this is a thing that happens to all genres. We're just kind of specifically pointing out the romantic comedy genre right now because that's what these films kind of fall into. But yeah, it's an evolution of that, of films like Bringing Up Baby and Philadelphia Story and all that stuff. And then probably a lot of films that have not stood up to the test of time that we haven't heard about and probably won't hear about because they just weren't that great, but yet they were still there in the public consciousness and they evolved and changed over time to the, again, wide range of quality and standard in romantic comedy that we have today, because it's very prevalent and there's lots of films. There's a lot that fly under the radar and that just kind of come out. Some people watch them whenever they come out, and some that, stand the test of time year over year over year. I mean, even the films that we've talked about that we feel, having watched them for the first time very recently, don't stand the test of time very well. You've Got Mail is still very much in the public consciousness. Sleepless in Seattle is still very well regarded as far as, even getting nominated for Oscars. And Joe versus the Volcano has kind of come back into relevance with a cult following in films like that, like we talked about at the top of the episode. So these films, like we do on this podcast all the time, is watching how film kind of started and watching these genres change and evolve, and then kind of analyzing how we got to where we are and how to take the best of the past and move forward and make them better as we go.
Yeah, exactly. And it'll be something that I'll be curious to see. You know what? I was just thinking about it. There are some rom-coms that are coming out, but they're just not the blockbusters anymore. They are streaming movies.
Okay, yeah,
there's been some major rom-coms that have come out in the past year or so on streaming services. I'm gonna feel bad because I can't remember most of their names, but they're definitely. I remember one coming out at least once a month last year on Netflix, and it being announced or somebody talking about it in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and of course, a couple months ago was kind of holiday season, which is pretty ripe for that kind of thing. But also, we're seeing a bleeding over of high-profile genre films being released in theaters and then splitting that between films that are being released on streaming services. So even, flipping mafia Martin Scorsese films with The Irishman coming out on Netflix, we're going to be seeing a lot more of that. And so we can't only think of marquee movie theater movies when we're thinking about the top films in any genre.
Exactly. So anyway, we've come a long way from Joe versus the Volcano.
Oh, yeah, definitely. But this is fascinating. And I think that, again, Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan just having fun and doing all these films together is really interesting. And seeing the various ways that these kinds of quirky romantic films were made throughout basically the entire scope of the 90s. Not to say that these encompass everything, but it is going from 1990 to 1998. We're seeing a whole decade in different types of romance films as portrayed through Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. So it's been a very fun episode.
Yeah, exactly. Anything else to talk about, Jonathan?
I don't think so. But next time we have a little bit less of a fun episode. Sorry, guys, we're so dark on this podcast.
Not fun as in unentertaining. Fun as in just dark.
Yeah. It's going to be much, much more somber of an episode. And something that you may not immediately think of when you think of somber, we're thinking about animation films. So we're having a guest on, because guests tend to mean animation on this show, but for now anyway. And Aaron Johnson will be joining us again to talk about 3 films that were all animated in Europe, and they all involve animals. Alex, what are those 3 films?
Well, first we're going to talk about Watership Down from 1978, which, as everybody knows, is a very happy story about a bunch of bunnies. Then we're going to talk about
happy bunnies.
Yeah. Then we're going to talk about Plague Dogs from 1982, which is a very happy story about puppies who realize that they can't get coronavirus because dogs are immune, and then just have a bunch of fun on empty streets. Just run around and play a lot. And then we're going to watch Felidae, which is from 1994, and it's German?
Yeah, I think it's German.
It's German?
I think Felidae is cat in German.
It's definitely not.
You don't think so? Feline?
Nope. In German, the word for cat is Katz. K-A-T-Z.
Oh, there you go.
It might be a Latin thing. I don't know. But it does sound like feline. I see where you're
Yeah.
going. It's just definitely not German. But Felidae is from 1994. It's about a bunch of cats, and I think it might be the foundation for Cats the Musical. I don't know for sure. I just told 3 lies and no truths.
Oh gosh. Yeah, so that's going to be very interesting, and we're excited to have Aaron back on the show. But if you would like to support the show, you can do so on Patreon. And our latest Patreon podcast subject that you can listen to is 116 Cameras, which is a documentary about an Auschwitz survivor and the way that she's being documented for museums and historical purposes and that kind of thing. So that was kind of the official wrap of our World War II series. So if you're interested in hearing a little bit more about that, you can go and subscribe on Patreon.
Well, that's about all the time we have for this episode.
If you have movie suggestions for us or just want to reach out, I can be found on Twitter at JSSatchel.
And I'm at Alex Garinger.
And I'm at the Blue Jay 1994.
And to find links to things that we talked about today, you can view them on the blog at thefilmlings.com.
If you like the show, let us know. Leave us a review on iTunes so other people will know what we're all about.
We definitely appreciate it.
Talk to you next time.
All right, see ya.
Rolling. Or speeding, I mean. Ready for clap? Clap received.
Must say speeding.
That's more work than any other sound mixer in Hollywood has done in a whole day.
That's true.
Or will do
and
for
not
the next
just because
3
it's
weeks.
not just because yesterday was Saturday.